All right, so in this video, we are going to see the development of absolutism in France, particularly under Louis XIV. He's often seen as the best example of European absolutism. See, there's a lot of problems going on in Europe. You had the French Wars of Religion that we've talked about in a previous lecture. You had civil wars, you had upheaval, chaos, and one potential solution to that at the time was the development of the idea of absolutism. Give the king absolute power. Put as much power as possible in the hands of the central government. Therefore, things can get done and order can be maintained. So we're going to look at the development of absolutism under Louis XIV. But before we get to Louis XIV, we're going to start Louis XIII because it was his reign that laid the foundation for absolutism in France. But oddly enough, it really wasn't Louis XIII that did the work. It was his chief advisor, Cardinal Richelieu, the man on the screen there. Now, if you've ever seen any Three Musketeer movie ever, he is always the villain in the movie, which is a little unfair. Don't get me wrong, he is super Machiavellian when it comes to politics. He is absolutely ruthless. But in his defense, most of what he does is for what he views as the betterment of France. Whatever is good for Louis XIII, who he serves, is good for France, right? And therefore good for Richelieu. So Richelieu is an interesting character. Like I say, he's a cardinal in the Catholic Church, high-ranking church official, but he's also Louis XIII's chief advisor, and he pretty much runs France for Louis XIII. And Louis XIII is pretty much okay with that. Louis and Richelieu have a very good relationship. Louis is content with having the perks of being the monarch without necessarily all the responsibility and letting Richelieu do his thing. And as I said, his thing is power. He is very Machiavellian. So some of the things Richelieu does to strengthen the power of the monarchy is he takes away the political and military rights of the Huguenots. He leaves their religious rights. He doesn't care about that. He's concerned with power, and he views the Huguenots as a potential threat. So he takes away their political and military rights that they got back in the Edict of Nantes. He also spied on the nobility. The nobility in France had a tradition of causing trouble, like in the French Wars of Religion. Occasionally, members of the royal family would plot against the king. Now, what's cool about Richelieu is he never had as many spies as people believed, but he let people believe he had that many spies because the simple fear of that many spies oftentimes kept people in check. And when he did find out about conspiracies, he ruthlessly and quickly executed the conspirators when possible and crushed the conspiracies. And that was enough to instill, say, a healthy fear in the nobility. So Richelieu brings all this power into the monarchy. Well, Louis XIII dies. The man that succeeds him is Louis XIV. Now, when Louis XIV becomes king, he is just a child. You cannot let a child run a kingdom. That's a horrible idea. So as Louis XIV is growing up, another cardinal, Cardinal Mazarin, runs France for Louis and does a good job of it. Because when Louis was a boy, the nobility, see, I told you that they caused trouble, rebelled against Louis, and Mazarin crushed that rebellion of the nobility. But this will put into the very young Louis XIV a constant fear and mistrust of the nobility. This leaves an imprint on him. It's almost like it psychologically scars him. So he's never going to trust the nobility. Keep that in mind. That will be important later. Well, when Louis is a young man, Mazarin dies. Everyone thinks that Louis will just pick another guy to run the kingdom for him. But Louis surprises everyone and gives this speech in which he officially announces that he will be in charge of France, and he even tells the government officials, you will not even sign a passport without my permission. His own mother laughed at the speech, did not think he was serious, but he was. Louis is a complicated man. He has a lot of flaws, but he took his job as king very, very seriously. He was a hard-working king. And even when he made mistakes, oftentimes it's because he thought it's what was best for France and his kingdom. In fact, he will get this nickname after he comes into power after Mazarian dies as the Sun King. Think about that. The sun dominates the daytime sky. Life comes from the sun. Power comes from the sun. Therefore, Louis will be the political son of France. And eventually, kind of like Europe itself, too. Under his guidance, France becomes the most powerful country on the European continent. So everything Louis does is about projecting this image of the Sun King. There's no casual Fridays for Louis, right? He always has to be performing. It's almost like the Sun King is a role he performs nonstop for the rest of his life, which I can imagine is very exhausting. So everything is about enforcing this idea: I am the Sun King, I am in charge, you are not, I can do things that you cannot. This constant projection of power, right? So you look at where he lived, the Palace of Versailles. It's not Versailles, don't be that guy. The Palace of Versailles. Your book informs you that Versailles provided three different roles. One, of course, that's where the king and his family lived, of course. But it's also where the government offices were. The government worked out of the palace. Louis said, you won't even sign a passport without my permission. So therefore, the king has to constantly be available. So it's basically he works out of his home. It's like a glorified at-home office. So the palace is where the king lives, but it's also where the government offices are. It's where the chief advisors to the king work day in and day out. It's also where the nobility come to ask favors. See, the nobility lose a lot of their power under Louis because he doesn't trust them. So the only way sometimes to get things done is to ask favors. And so they would have to come to the palace. Also, while at the palace, Louis encouraged them to gamble, and many of them got into debt because of the gambling. And when they would go to Louis asking money to get them out of the debt, and of course he would oblige them, but now they owe him a favor, right? It's very Machiavellian of him. He's channeling his inner Richelieu right there, right? Because if they're indebted to him, he can control them. But something your book I don't think necessarily does a good job of demonstrating, of explaining, is that another reason for the Palace of Versailles is it physically demonstrated his power. Right? As a physical sign of the Sun King. Look at where I live. Look at what I built. In fact, what you see on the screen there, before he had the Palace of Versailles built, the only thing there was largely swampland and an old royal hunting lodge that Louis XIII liked. And Louis XIV said, I want my palace here. I don't want to live in Paris. I don't trust the people of Paris or the nobility. I want my palace out in the country in Versailles. And engineers said, you can't build it here. It's swampland. And Louis' response was, figure it out. And so they drained the swamp and they built this palace. Louis ordered nature to bend to his will. See, it is a physical sign of his power. When you stepped into Versailles, he wanted you to be in awe. What you see on the screen is the Hall of Mirrors. Now, to you, a mirror is not a big deal. But when the palace was built, mirrors were super expensive because they were really hard to make. In fact, only one city in Italy really knew how to make quality mirrors, and Louis hired workers from that city to make these mirrors. So if you were alive during his reign and you walked into the Hall of Mirrors, not only would you be stunned by the beauty, you'd be stunned by the cost. It's a reminder, I am the king and you are not. I live here and you do not. I had this built and you cannot. I am the Sun King. So everything's about that projection of power. Now, a king cannot do everything, though, and the best kings have the best advisors. So he established a royal council to advise him. Interesting thing, though, no nobility or members of the royal families on the council. He didn't even trust members of his own family, you see. Right? Don't forget that rebellion when he was a child. Right? No, he filled the royal council up with commoners. Now, highly, highly, highly educated, skilled commoners. These are not peasant farmers, but commoners, because then he can easily threaten them. Right? I made you, I can unmake you. Right? I can fire you. You owe your loyalty to me. He felt he could trust them better. And they do a really good job actually. Interesting side note, though, eventually some of these commoners in France, they're going to get a little tired of being lorded over by the nobility. More about that in another chapter. But as another expression of his power, he began to persecute the Huguenots again. See, Richelieu took away their political and military rights. Louis is going to take away their religious rights. Louis himself was a devout Catholic, but also he believes in absolutism. So if he says France is Catholic, it's Catholic. That's it. If you're not Catholic, get your stuff and get out, which a lot of the Huguenots did. It was a huge mistake on the part of Louis. Many of the Huguenots were wealthy and highly educated, and they took their money and training elsewhere, like to the Germanic states and to England and even over here to the New World. Remember, we learned this with Philip II. Tolerance is almost always the best policy, not persecution. But for him, it was a demonstration of his power. If I say you're Catholic, you're going to be Catholic. Politics and religions all mixed together back then. Now, even though he viewed himself as a sun king, he still has to rely on the local government, right? He can't manage what's going on in Toulon on a daily basis or Orleans or out in the provinces. So he still has to rely on the local government. So you can't really have 100% absolute power because no king is a deity. It doesn't work that way. You've got to rely on people like Jean-Baptiste Colbert. That's not Colbert. Don't be that guy. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was Louis's Minister of Finance, the guy in charge of making money for France, and therefore Louis the 14th. One time Louis the 14th said, I am the state. Like, I am France. What's good for France is good for me. What's good for Louis is good for France. So it's Colbert's job to bring money into France. And Colbert is a big fan of mercantilism, which we learned about in chapter 13. The idea that a nation's wealth is based on how much gold and silver you have. And maybe you've heard that expression, to make money, you've got to spend money. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert, he invests money in building roads and bridges and renovating harbors throughout France and canals, all to make transportation easier. Therefore, you can transport goods easier, and therefore you couldn't sell them easier. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was really, really good at making money. Unfortunately, Louis was really, really good at spending it. Right? Takes a lot of money to be the Sun King. Think about the Palace of Versailles. Forget how much it cost to build it. Think about how much it cost to keep it up. Just the cleaning staff, the gardening staff that it takes. It's the size of a small city, right? So it's very expensive being the Sun King. Also, Louis loved war a lot. He fought a lot, all the time, to make France powerful. Because as France is powerful, therefore he's powerful. For instance, he wanted one of his relatives to be the king of Spain, and Europe went to war over it because they didn't want his relative on the throne of Spain. Right? They thought that was a horrible idea for the balance of power. So he fought multiple wars. So there's Jean-Baptiste Colbert bringing all kinds of money in, and as soon as it comes in, it goes right out the window. So what is the legacy of Louis XIV? It's complicated. By the time he dies, culturally, France is the leader of Europe. People mimic French fashion and culture and poetry and music and architecture. Other kings try to copy the Palace of Versailles. From a military standpoint, it was one of, if not the most powerful country on the European continent. So that was great. That was excellent. Had a lot of political power on the continent. But it's in financial crisis. All that took so much money. And to make things worse, when Louis took away so much power from the nobility, in exchange, he didn't tax them. He pretty much let them out of their taxes. So you're not taxing the richest part of your population. That's just bad business. By the time you get to Louis XVI, the financial crisis in France will be so bad that eventually the people are going to rebel and actually overthrow the Bourbon dynasty, which was started by his ancestor Henry IV. Right? So his legacy is complicated. Right? He goes down as being one of the best examples of absolutism, but he planted the seeds of his family's destruction and of the monarch's destruction, which in 2 generations will fall apart and actually literally be beheaded in the French Revolution.